Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philip Rees from BIQ. Thank you for taking the time to participate in today's workshop. This is the fifth in a series of workshops delivered in this webinar format. The first three workshops were specifically designed to assist you with both your understanding and preparation of key elements of your 18.2 and 18.B SBIR STTR submission. Today's workshop topic focuses on the SBIR STTR proposal evaluation and debrief processes, as well as submitting a compliant proposal. Please limit today's questions to the scope of this workshop topic. Next slide. Today we're going to focus on the SBIR evaluation and debrief processes and ways to ensure you submit a compliant proposal. We'll have an ongoing dialogue with our panelists, and we will also take questions from participants on the webinar. Today's slides contain a lot of information that you will find useful to review following the workshop, but it's recommended that you focus on key points and messages that the presenters and panelists highlight. We will send an audio recording within 2 days of this workshop, as well as a transcript within 10 business days. That being said, the objectives of today's workshop are to provide you with a basic understanding of the evaluation and debrief processes. We'll speak directly to technical and commercialization plan elements that evaluators review and how to best address these points. We'll also explore the debrief process in detail and how you can use debrief to improve future proposals. All participant microphones are muted for the duration of the webinar. Today's workshop is structured as follows: presentation, panel discussion, participant Q&A, and post-workshop survey. At the end of this webinar, you'll be automatically redirected to a page where you'll be asked to provide some feedback regarding today's workshop. It should take you less than 5 minutes to complete the survey. We will also send the survey to the email you use to register. If you have questions during the presentation, please click on the blue question mark located at the top of the page. If you are unable to pose your question during the workshop, please send an email to sbirtraining@bycube.com within 1 business day. Responses to questions not covered during the workshop will be addressed and distributed via email within 30 business days following the conclusion of the workshop. Today we are joined by DOD SBIR STTR presenters and panelists with vast experience. I'd like to remind speakers to please state their name, organization, and role prior to sharing their thoughts. Our lead presenters today will be Lynn Jenkins from BIQ, Jason Talley from BIQ, and Jangela Shumskas from the Cali Group. We are also joined by our panelists: Larry Pollack from Chemical Biological Defense, Susan Sellis from DARPA, Colleen Gibney from the U.S. Army Medical Research and Material Command, and Susan Fithian, also with MRNC. With that introduction, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jangela to get us started. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the workshop. As we get started, we're first going to talk about the evaluation criteria and review, but let's just start with this particular slide. The first thing to know is there is no material difference between the phase 1 and phase 2 evaluations. What might vary by component is the weight of each criteria, and that would, of course, factor into the evaluation. But otherwise, the 3 criteria that's used for phase 1 is also used for phase 2. Next slide. Now, the proposal components that are evaluated, it's essentially your technical volume, but what makes a complete proposal is volume 1, which is your proposal cover sheet, volume 2, obviously your technical volume, volume 3, which is your cost volume, and volume 4 is the company commercialization report. A quick note on cost volume and company commercialization report, or CCR. The cost volume isn't evaluated. There is no evaluation factor for that, provided you're staying within the funded or the stated thresholds in the BAA. But if you're selected for award, it could become a factor during the review process before proceeding to contract award. The company commercialization report, if you're a company that is brand spanking new to DOD, SBIR, and STTR, SBIR and STTR in general, it is quite possible that you might have a blank company commercialization report. That CCR is a narrative report, and there is some quantitative data in there as well that's used to report metrics and and qualitative information against prior phase 1 and phase 2 awards, and the predominant focus is phase 2. Next slide. So the evaluation process, we pretty much covered this on the previous slide. But one thing to note here, in the evaluation and review process for SBIR and STTR, unlike other BAAs, there is not a review panel or source selection board. The reviews and evaluations are typically done by by individuals. Next slide. So on this particular slide, I just want to call out that this is an example that we received from Air Force. So, and this is specific to the phase 2 proposal evaluation process from the Air Force. So as they're going through their evaluations, these are the pieces, these are the components that they are actually evaluating. And anyone who's looking at this that's familiar with the SBIR and STTR processes, it kind of looks like the elements of your entire proposal with the various 4 components combined. So that is a note that everyone should bookmark, the fact that when you're submitting a proposal, this is focused on phase 2, but also phase 1. Make sure you're following the instructions. Phase 1 instructions are in the DOD front matter as well as the component specific matter. Typically, your phase 2 proposal instructions will come directly from the component. Next slide. And this is a continuation of what we saw on the other page. Again, notice the parallels here on the evaluation factors that are used as a part of the 3 main criteria and how closely this mirrors what ought to be going into your proposal. Next slide. So this introduction here on the evaluation process, I would say it's equally applicable for phase 1 as well. Essentially, your proposals are evaluated on a competitive basis by SMEs, scientists, engineers, and other technical personnel. Your proposals are protected because they are considered both procurement sensitive and proprietary. Next slide. Again, evaluation criteria here. These are the 3 main criteria. It's the same for phase 1. It's the same for both SBIR and STTR, and those are technical merit, qualifications of personnel, and potential for commercial application. Again, to reiterate what I said earlier, the only difference between a phase 1 evaluation and phase 2 evaluation is the weighting of this criteria. I also want to note that weighting of criteria may vary by component. How the criteria is weighted is advertised in the instructions, whether it's the phase 2 proposal instructions or the phase 1 proposal instructions. Next slide. Again, phase 2 proposal evaluation process, I believe we got this from Army, Lynn? Or Air Force? Okay, so this is another Air Force example. The only thing that I want to call out here, this is against criteria or criterion 1, which is technical merit. Again, as you're looking at this, take note of the fact that these are the exact same elements that you are asked to provide in your proposal. So the key takeaway from this slide and the next slide is if you are missing one of the required or requested elements for your proposal, then that's going to be reflected in how your proposal is both reviewed and or evaluated. Next slide. Qualifications of personnel. So this is basically your principal investigator, key investigator, supporting staff, and consultants or contractors. If you are partnering with a university, the key personnel that you're using with the university would be included in here. If you are subcontracting to a named entity, the key staff that you are utilizing through that subcontract, you would also want to have here. You have to recognize that qualifications of personnel don't just extend to the ability to technically achieve results. It's also the ability to commercialize the results. And so that might mean that as you are working on your proposal, if you take a look at your compliance matrix, which we'll go into a little bit later, you need to make sure that you have folks that can execute the work as proposed. And then if that work is successful, bring the technology or solution to market. Next page. The potential for commercial application. The bottom line here is you need to fully articulate your value proposition, both to the market and to the DoD. So if you think that you're doing something better, faster, cheaper than the current state of the art, you need to state that. And you also need to be able to articulate how you're doing it better, faster, cheaper, and also how you're better than the competition that might be trying to do the same. You also need to be able to describe the milestones it's going to take in order to get your technology to reach both the warfighter and the commercial market. If you are unable to articulate that type of strategy, for criterion C, you might not be reviewed as favorably as another proposer. Next slide. So this is proposal selection process. I think for ease of reading, we'll just call it proposal review or evaluation process. So once the proposal evaluation or proposal review is complete, there are two things that are going to happen. The first is you're going to get notification as to whether or not your proposal was competitively selected or not selected for award. When you get that letter, it's going to have a lot of important information for the way ahead in both instances. So your notification letter is going to have the instructions for requesting a debrief. So the debrief is going to be feedback on your proposal, and we'll go more into the debrief a little bit later. But it's also, and if you were selected for award, it's going to give you some information regarding the timeline of what you can expect moving forward. Very quickly, the SBA guidelines and the legislation that authorizes the SBIR and STTR programs is very explicit. You must receive notice within 90 days of the solicitation close date. So if you have not received a select or non-select letter and you notice that it's been pretty darn close to 3 months since you submitted your proposal, it's probably a good idea to contact the component program management office and find out if something went wrong. A quick tip for notification letters: in advance, if it's not in the proposal instructions, you should contact the component SBIR STTR program management office and find out what email address is used to send these communications and make sure you add them to your contact list so these very critical and important emails don't go to your junk box. You also want to make sure that your CO, the most updated information, is within the relevant components database. So if you have changes to your CO between the time of submission and during the evaluation and review process, you should directly contact the component program management office to update that information so you don't miss any critical communication. As far as finding selection data, you can find selection data is a little harder to come by. What you can do is just check the various component-specific SBIR and STTR websites. Places like Army will actually post their select data, but most people don't. And award data is posted at sbir.gov/awards. I guess the only thing that I'll say about that is there is at least 2-year latency from the time it's actually awarded by DoD and when it shows up in that database. It's something that the government is working to correct, but at this time, predominantly, all you can find is award data. Next slide. Okay, proposal selection process. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is a really, really good process that is available. It's public facing from the Navy SBIR website, and it really goes through what it means to be a selectee. Again, a selectee means you received a letter that says you were competitively selected for contract award. It doesn't mean that you've been awarded. It doesn't mean you are absolutely going to get an award. It just means that based on your proposal, if all the stars align, you will get an award. So most of the selection letters will say you cannot incur costs. If you do incur costs, it is not reimbursable by the government. Another quick thing on the selection process, it doesn't happen very rarely, or it happens very rarely, but just because you received a non-select letter does not always mean that the door is 1,000% closed for you. Most non-selects aren't because the proposal wasn't very, very good against all three criteria. It's mainly because they weren't the best, and these programs have limited funding. So every now and again, funding becomes available and a non-select can magically become a select. And I guess that's something that I failed to say earlier, that these programs are incredibly competitive. And so having a very good proposal is very often not good enough. You need to be excellent. You really need to show how, from a technical perspective, you understand the current state of the art, and you are not doing something, you might be doing something evolutionary, but you might also be doing something revolutionary, and you have to be able to state how you're doing that. And if you're not, then I have to say you might want to consider whether or not you should be submitting a proposal, just because of the time and expense in doing that. So make sure you're able to articulate that before you even submit. And then these other nuances regarding the selection process, everyone, if you don't have a copy of these slides, you'll be getting them and you can read them at your leisure. Next. Same thing here. Oh, wait a minute. No, not the same thing here. Sorry. This here actually demonstrates how the Army advertises their selection data. And what I actually really love about these numbers is it shows just how competitive this process is. So for the 18-1 solicitation for phase 1, Army had 100 topics and received over 1,500 proposals. Now, the old rubric used to be every topic received about 3 or 4 awards, but that again varies by component. But if you want to go by that, and let's just do some math, it looks like every topic, ceteris paribus, got at least 15 proposals. So straight off the bat, if we're saying that Army is going to award 3 or 4 against every topic, straight off the bat, we know that there's going to be 11 non-selects, right? I'm not saying that that's how it worked. I'm just using these numbers as an example. So the process is very, very competitive. The Army also lists with their selection data how the evaluation took place, and then how to move forward for those selected proposers, how it's going to move forward for award. But again, this information generally isn't available from all components.
Got it. Angela, thanks for that insight. I wanted to see if any of our component panelists had any additional thoughts on the evaluation or selection process before we moved on to the debrief portion of the presentation. Susan from DARPA, any thoughts from your side?
Are you asking about this specific slide or just all the slides that have been presented thus far?
Correct, all the slides thus far. The macro topic is of evaluation or selection as it relates to DARPA. Okay, so yeah, I do have, I made some notes as Jangela was going along. So DARPA, we weigh the evaluation criteria in descending order of importance for both phase 1 and phase 2. The Commercialization Achievement Index that's assigned by DOD is quite subjective in our view and for the mission of DARPA specifically. So that particular, that score that's given based on your company commercialization report is used at the discretion of the PM and is based on the technology that's being sought. Because for us, we are on the cutting edge of science and technology. Therefore, just because your CAI score is not necessarily high doesn't mean this is a hard problem that we don't want you working on. So it's going to be very subjective based on the PM's view of what the landscape looks like for that particular technology area.
and that's one of the things that in my personal opinion, the benchmarking and the CAI do not take into consideration when those calculations are made. So again, that's why we leave it to the PM to use that score at his or her discretion when evaluating proposals. And even though cost is not evaluated, it's extremely important to include documentation to support how your costs were determined. So as an example, if you're proposing travel, you need to include downloads or screenshots of travel estimates from Expedia, Travelocity, whatever online system you're using, because even though it's not an evaluation factor, should you be selected for award, those estimates will be sent to the contracting officer. And if you don't have any, they're going to have to reach out to you and get all that documentation, and it's just going to add to the time it takes to make the award. Jangela also mentioned the communications that you get from agencies regarding your corporate official emails. And one of the things that I suggest that companies consider is perhaps setting up a general email box, something that's not tied to one specific person, so that if your corporate official leaves or your contracts manager leaves or whatever, you don't have to worry about your email communications going into a black hole somewhere. It goes to your email box that you have set up for SBIR and STTR communications. And then the last couple of items I have are DARPA doesn't post the selections. Although I like that Army blurb, it doesn't really say much as far as who, selections or non-selections, but at least it gives everybody an idea that we have completed the source selection process. So I might consider adopting something similar, but for all the reasons Jangela mentioned, all kinds of things can happen during negotiation and award. We just do not feel comfortable listing all the people that got selections. So we would prefer that once the awards are made, then we, however it's announced by DOD, it goes out that way. And then lastly, if at all possible, don't change anything after you've submitted your proposal. Don't change your name. If you can possibly help it, don't get acquired. Don't change your personnel if possible, because all of those things will either cause you to become ineligible, or it will again drag out the award time, because there's extra steps if we're able to accept the name change or accept the personnel change. There's extra steps that are involved. So if at all possible, try to remain intact until the award is made, and it's still up to our discretion whether we, go forward or not. If you change personnel, if you change a PI that, is the leader of their field, and you change it to somebody else that we've never heard of, we still have the discretion, not to go forward with you. But I would say that it's better to do it later than during the whole solicitation process after you've submitted your proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Susan or Colleen from MRMC, any thoughts from you guys' perspective?
This is Colleen from MRMC for DHA. I would just mention that Jangela had kind of mentioned earlier that sometimes a non-select, there's doors open. I would say less so in military medicine. These are very, very highly competitive programs. And while I would encourage any company to, take a look at your prior art and whether it makes sense to apply for additional opportunities, we sometimes get, disappointed respondents contacting us and saying, well, could you get more money? Do you think maybe you could fund me? And that is not, unfortunately, we're not able to flex our source selection in that manner. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Larry, any thoughts from the CBD?
Yes, this is Larry Pollack from the ChemBio Defense SBIR program. I just have some really high-level 30,000-foot comments based on what has been presented so far. In every one of these webinars, one of the things that has been stressed over and over again, so I'll stress it now, is read the instructions. That's both from the Department of Defense, the front matter, as we often call it, and the component-specific instructions. Next thing would be, how is the proposed technology innovative? Are you making a case that it is better than the state of the art? We've mentioned the term risk, and we will mention it again later on. SBIR does accept risk. We want risk. We want revolutionary and evolutionary technologies. But at the same point in time, we also want to make sure that the results are achievable. And the last comment has to do with the bulk of the phase 1 and the phase 2 proposals, as far as where the meat of the matter is, really resides in how you articulate what it is you're going to do in the statement of work by task, as if you're actually completing an experiment in your head and you write that down on paper. Now, it's true that everything isn't going to go according to plan, because let's face it, this is research and development, and where there are issues, are there risk mitigation strategies where you have alternative approaches that you would utilize to address the challenges that may be encountered during the period of performance? Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. Jangela, I'll turn it back to you to discuss the debrief process.
Okay, so if we can forward to the next slide. So in this section here, we're just going to go over the essential elements of what a debrief is, what it's for, how you get one, how it varies by component, and what you can do with it. Next slide. So the first step is, how do you go about getting a debrief? I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but typically the select and non-select letters will have information regarding debriefs. The one thing that I should add is not every component debriefs successful offerors. So what that means is if you receive a select letter and there is not information in that letter about how to request a debrief, the chances are that particular component does not do debriefs to successful offerors. That doesn't mean that if you're a successful offeror and there aren't instructions that you can't request one, but it's very likely that that request will not be honored. For companies that receive a non-select letter, again, instructions for how to request that debrief should be in that non-select letter. Some components advertise the debrief process in their instructions. So you might be able to look there, but I would say by and large, most people are putting those instructions in that letter. So again, debriefs are time sensitive. There's a clock that runs against them. In most cases, not all, there's a 30-day time limit from the date that you receive your non-select letter. You have 30 calendar days to request your debrief. That is not the case across the board. There are some components which utilize FAR 15 to the letter, which means you have 72 hours from the time you receive your non-select letter. So really pay attention to those instructions, not to keep hammering this, but everyone needs to make sure that you're able to receive the communications that come both from DOD and the specific components. I guess the only other thing that I'll say here is the mechanism by which debriefs are both delivered and requested varies by component. Back in the old days, when I was with the Army or almost 20 years ago, it was all done by mail. So you would mail in your request for a debrief and we would mail one back. I haven't been with the Army for a very long time, but I have to imagine that that process has evolved significantly with technology. That said, they all have a different process. Pay attention to the process, because just like a proposal, if you don't follow the instructions, you may not like what you either get or don't get. Next slide. So pre-award proposal and the debrief process, I believe here is where we move into a panel discussion.
Absolutely. So I want to turn to our components to get some thoughts on the debrief from each component that we have here. I'll start with Colleen and Susan from MRMC. Any thoughts?
Hi, this is Susan from MRMC for DHA, SBIR, and STTR. I just wanted to point out that for DHA, SBIR, and STTR, our process is that we only provide debriefs to unsuccessful offers, and they will have 30 days to request that debrief after they receive a non-select notice. and then we have 30 days to return it to them via email. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan from DARPA, any considerations?
So at DARPA, our debrief is called a technical evaluation narrative. So basically, it's verbatim feedback from our evaluators on proposals, and those feedback narratives are provided to all proposers automatically. So when each proposer logs in to get to their notification letter, there will be a way. It'll be obvious how to retrieve your debrief or technical evaluation narrative when you retrieve your letter. Thank you.
Got it. And Larry, how does CBD do it?
Well, as you can tell, there are differences between the components. So for ChemBioDefense, when we send out our selection and non-selection letters, there's information to request a debriefing. We also use the term feedback summary. We encourage even the successful offers to request that information because no proposal is absolutely perfect. And there are weaknesses that are identified. And it can be very useful during a kickoff meeting once you're under contract to discuss some of those perceived weaknesses, whether they're real or not. It's worth having that discussion, again, to mitigate risk. For the non-selected offers, we certainly, of course, encourage that 100% of those non-selected offers request a debriefing. It's interesting that over the years, I've noted approximately 70% of the non-selected offers request a debriefing. My question is, what happened to the other 30%? Obviously, time and effort, which equate to money, went into developing and submitting that proposal. Why don't you want to know what the evaluators saw or didn't see in that proposal? So by all means, I'd like to see 100% request the information, but we do it on a request basis, and that is somewhat based on our technology that we have available to us to be able to provide these debriefing summaries, feedback summaries from the technical evaluation teams to the offers by way of reply email.
Got it, Larry, I appreciate that insight. I'd now like to introduce Lynn Jenkins from VibeCubed, who is our small business subject matter expert. Lynn is going to discuss how to respond with a compliant proposal. Lynn, take it away.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody. Great conversation to this point. I know that a lot of you are wondering, now that you know what's being evaluated, you know that you can get information in a feedback debrief or selection evaluation process. The key is what we'd like to do is to drill down a little bit more into how to ensure you're compliant. So although I don't want to repeat it, I will repeat it. Step one, you need to read the DOD instructions. Step two, read the component instructions. And I think from what you've heard today so far, all of the instructions will tell you exactly how you need to respond and what you need to respond to. The key, I think we'll talk about a little bit later, is how do you really achieve the type of feedback that the government is looking for. So we'll delve into that a little bit later. The first thing I'd want to say is that when you get any proposal, whether it's a BAA solicitation or just even a regular federal RFP, the first thing you want to do is create a master list of all of the content you're going to need, all of the information. You want to do that as early as possible. You want to have an actual, what I call a matrix, which could be a simple Word document or an Excel spreadsheet that lists every single element. Earlier, Jangela showed us a list of all of the proposal pieces that need to be covered. You want to create a list of all of those elements, put that in a spreadsheet, and ensure that you can check that off. Next slide. So in terms of compliance, let's think about it in two ways. Number one, you have the administrative compliance. So I think you're all familiar with that who've submitted proposals for BAAs. You get a set of instructions. You know that there are 4 different volumes. Administratively, there are different fonts. There are different page lengths. Technical volume might be 5 pages if it's a special topic. So the key is you need to understand administratively, at minimum, you don't want to go over page limits. You want to make sure the font is correct. So those are the very simplistic things you need to do. The second part of compliance are in all of the volumes. So we saw earlier the technical cost, commercialization, company commercialization report, and cover sheet. This is the cover. So you want to make sure that you have, at least at minimum, you've got all those volumes covered. We're going to talk a little bit more about tools. We want to make sure that you know that there are some prescribed tools that DoD actually publishes, unlike in some of the other federal agencies outside of DoD. They actually produce a checklist. So there's a preparation, there are tips. So they help you, I believe, in the SBIR, STTR process to ensure that you at least have all of the documentation you're going to need. We'll talk a little bit more about schedule and milestones. Larry mentioned that the importance of ensuring the government knows how you're going to actually achieve your, whether it's feasibility or in phase 2, that you'll actually have a prototype. You want to make sure that you have the right resources. So you need to have dates, resources, map all of your evaluation criteria for all the tasks that you're going to do. And of course, what the successful companies do, they develop a methodology to ensure that all of their proposals follow the same set of instructions. They check it off and they know that they're going to be uploading their proposals on time, under page budget limit, and that they know that they'll have a good chance of being evaluated. Next slide. Let's just talk about some preparation tips. And again, I'm not going to read everything. As we mentioned earlier when we started the workshop, we've provided a lot of the content for you to read as an after presentation, but I did want to highlight some of the things that are critical. The first thing is you need to make sure you read all of the instructions and understand that the component instructions sometimes are different than the DoD instructions. So the key is read the instructions. Some of the very simple things you need to do is to make sure that you are registered, that you make sure that your costs adhere to different criteria, and you want to make sure that the project abstract, which is included on your cover sheet, your technical abstract, make sure that doesn't contain any proprietary information. So we know that the proposal is protected, but the abstract is released to the public. So you want to make sure that that cover sheet, technical abstract, doesn't contain any proprietary information. Next slide. Following with an example again of the phase 1 instructions, they tell you mark your proprietary information as instructed in section 5.3. So this was a specific set of instructions for a BAA. It's just critical that you read those instructions because it'll tell you where the markings need to occur. Bullet number 3, where it talks about the headers. So it tells you, every page, company name, topic number, proposal number. We had a couple of questions from companies that asked if companies that typically submit proposals are more prone to getting selected. They may not see your company name or the cover sheet, so they're always they're going to look at your actual proposal. So if they don't have that cover sheet, you want them to know who you are. And in this example, they wanted you to limit your technical volume to 20 pages, and that was for under phase 1. So again, the key is these are directions that are actually out there. If you Googled, you would find these, but this is actually in one of the archives from 18.1. Next slide. We're going to go a little bit deeper into the technical volume, which is volume 2. Again, from the questions that we received, as well as where companies many times struggle, it's in understanding how to respond to the technical volume. So we saw this in an earlier slide. We're going to go into, go to the next slide, please. Again, these are all of the areas that you saw that were included in the proposal, all the content that needs to be included, as well as the evaluation criteria. Next slide. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what Jangela was talking about as it relates to evaluation criteria. So we know that we talked about the soundness, the technical merit, and innovation. And Larry mentioned innovation. He used some terminology, revolutionary, evolutionary. So I think a lot of companies may struggle with how do we actually articulate that in a proposal. And when government looks for selections based on best value, they tell you in descending order for this particular 18.1 BAA what they're looking for. I think we just heard from DARPA that their evaluation criteria was in ascending order. So I think it's key that you make sure you read and understand when they talk about soundness, what is soundness? So I did a synonym search for soundness. They talk about, is it robust? free from defect, sturdy, durable. So as you start to think about your technology, you need to always go beyond just the technical description of what it does, but talk about its value to the warfighter. When you talk about innovation, some of the other words that you want to think about are upheaval, transformation, restructuring, reorganization, metamorphosis, modernization, new methods, new ideas. That's what the government's looking for when they talk about best value. How do you get there? So early on, when you're thinking about responding to a phase one, or you're just starting to do your, trying to think about how you're going to take your technology from research to prototype, you need to start thinking about who will want to procure or who would want to commercialize your technology. So you want to start that very early. Jangela mentioned a little bit about the qualifications of the proposed, your principal investigators. That also is critical for companies that feel you don't have any past performance or past experience or commercialization expertise. You can leverage the experience of those PIs or principal investigators or your other consultants or other prime contractors if you're doing any type of teaming. So think about the qualifications. The government wants to ensure that you have the technology, the manufacturing, the capability, the qualifications to perform the work. So you'd have to create a compelling story. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the commercialization plan. Next page. Cost reasonableness, we talked about that. And I think actually DARPA had just a great example of the way that they approach the cost, costing the evaluation. The reasonableness and realism, they want you to cover that as much as you can, but if you have a compelling solution, you may have an opportunity to have a discussion after award, post-award. So the technical reviewers are always looking at information in the proposal. And what they tell you is that don't assume that they know your company. So if you have repetitive proposal submissions, they may not necessarily know it's you. So the key is you want to just act as if this is something that maybe even new reviewers are reading. Make sure that you include relevant information, journals, articles, literature, anything that's going to help substantiate your proposal. Next slide. So let's just talk about some best practices. And actually the Air Force has a publication they generated called Best Practices. And I think it's something that would be worthwhile to read. We'll send that out when we send our final slides. But you want to make sure that on the administrative slide, you have a proposal plan. So a proposal plan meaning, how are you going to respond? So I think to Larry's point from CBD earlier, he talked about you don't want to invest in something that you're not going to be able to complete. So you want to make sure you have a plan. Who are your assets? Who's going to work on this for you? Who's going to do the writing? Do you have technical writers? Do you have people that know the subject matter that you're going to be responding with? Do you have a schedule? So you want to make sure you have a schedule for submission. The most recent BAA was due on June 20th. So what you don't want to do is upload it on June 20th, and potentially there's a technical issue in getting your actual proposal uploaded. Or you upload your proposal and you find out when we uploaded it, it was 20 pages. Now, once it's on the site, it actually is 22. So you want to make sure that you don't leave anything to chance. There are some sample templates. If you, I think at SBIR, the website, there's a template. But I think the key is if you just take the slides that we showed you earlier with the proposal, like the order of what needs to appear in that proposal response, that becomes your template. So it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to guess. Make sure that you have, again, best practices for companies that are successful in submitting SBIR proposals. You want to have a resource that's assigned to make sure you have that checklist, they manage it, and check all the artifacts. Artifacts meaning the cover sheet, any other documentation that's required. Make sure that you have your sam.gov or your SBIR that you signed onto the website. Make sure you follow the numbering and numerical. You don't have to make that up. You do not want to ignore the administrative instructions. Some proposal submissions are not reviewed because they are over page count, or you don't want to, again, spending all of that time, you do not want to have your proposal, just pushed aside because you didn't follow those instructions. If you can as well, you want to exclude information that's not really relevant. You don't want to have extra non-relevant marketing information if that's not called upon. So you want to make sure, be respectful of the reader as well. They want to get to the brunt of why they should potentially select you. Next slide. You also want to make sure that you check the CITES Q&A. That we had a webinar, a previous webinar actually, 2 webinars ago. We talked about the importance of checking questions and amendments. So ensure until you are able to upload your actual proposal, check to see if there are any pertinent questions that were answered that you need to make changes in your proposal. So you want to make sure you check the listserv and also check the CITES. So that's a Q&A that the government responds to companies that have asked questions. And you also want to perform a quality assurance check, spelling, grammar. The last thing you want to do is have a document that's difficult to read or it looks like you didn't pay attention to the quality of the document. And if you can also, if you don't want to speak in multiple voices, make it sound as if there's one writer that's written this. So it sounds very trivial, but it's important so people know that you took the time, because they might equate the time you took with reviewing your proposal with necessarily going back and making sure you have the right your technical solution. Next slide. So again, checklist, and let's talk a little bit more about on the technical side. Make sure that you align your technical solution to the BA objective. And we're going to talk more about this when we talk about just under the technical volume. But that's critical. You don't want to just talk about your product, but the government needs to know, and I think either Larry or Jangela mentioned it, talking about value proposition. What's the value? So it's not simply what your product does, but how it's going to improve or provide some kind of benefit to the warfighter. You want to clearly describe the innovation. What is it? How is it going to work? People were talking about the quantitative or qualitative metrics, faster, less expensive, performance enhancements. And also, you want to talk about how it's going to improve the topic solution. So if you're proposing for phase 1, you should immediately be thinking about what's the follow-on for phase 2. So what are they trying to do with that topic? Does it stop at the end of phase 1, or is there potential for commercialization at phase 3? So these are early considerations you need to make as you start to create your proposal. I think we also mentioned, make sure if you're going to use the word innovative, you need to say, what's the innovation? How are they going to realize it? When does it occur? And why? What's the why of the technology? So to say something is innovative won't be enough. You need to describe what that innovation is in more detail. Next slide. So let's talk about, I'm going to just call this a big onion. We're going to peel back that onion layer by layer. So in the technical volume, the first thing is they ask you about identification and significance of the opportunity. This is where you want to show specifically your expertise. Like, how are you going to address the work that's been, that's the statement of work or the task that they're looking for. How are you going to approach that? So it's showing your understanding of not just the problem that they've probably already articulated. Maybe you've had conversations with the topic author, and you can demonstrate that you know something more. Or maybe you've had a discussion with a prime contractor, and you've been able to glean some information that maybe some of your competitors don't have. So the key is ensuring that when you talk about the problem, make sure that you talk about the opportunity that your technology is going to provide. The other thing is, in terms of technical objectives, it's like, that means what is your proposed, what's your plan? Under technical objectives, it's item number 2 on this slide, they're not necessarily asking for you to restate all of the tasks, but they want you to determine what's the feasibility. So what are the objectives to determine feasibility? And that's typically just a 1-pager or less. So this is not, again, a rehashing of your total technical solution. And in this, under objectives, you'd like to include, what are the achievements, outcomes? Like, how are you going to meet those expectations? So again, think about your technical solution, thinking about that checklist or compliance matrix. For your technical solution, you should create just a simple spreadsheet and just address those questions. So if there are people that are assisting you in developing that proposal response, that's what the government is looking for. Next slide. This is just an example of a BA that requested a statement of work. And I just included it because we did have a couple of questions asking about any kind of, human and animal subjects. And the key is, if you are in this particular area, you want to make sure that you contact your SBIR office at the agency prior to phase 1 to make sure you understand under what circumstances research can be done. So for the folks that are in that field, this again is an example. You may not need to respond and have an actual statement of work or SOW. Next slide. So let's talk about the statement of work. So under the statement of work, you need to ensure that, number one, you talk about your detailed description of what you're going to do. So we all know that phase 1 is feasibility study. How are you going to get there? You want to just talk about what are the research activities? What are the research activities in phase 1, and then also thinking about phase 2. If you're successful in phase 1, the obvious follow-on is that you'll have a phase 2. So you need to be prepared. In the SOW, you need to talk about the tasks that are planned. So what's the task outline? So again, just a list of what's going to be planned over the span of the phase 1 effort. How and where the work's going to be conducted. This is where you'd want to have a major schedule of events, milestones, progress reports, and the final products to be delivered. So this is actually your checklist, or just a micro level of your checklist. You want to talk about methods. So how are you going to achieve each objective or task? The key is to be as succinct as possible, to be as concise, and they tell you they should be discussed explicitly and in detail. So this section, that's the very last sentence on this page, this should be the substantial portion of the technical volume. So again, the statement of work, the tasks that you're going to accomplish. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? When are you going to deliver the final product? And I think certain components have certain timeframes where they feel that you're going to be able to deliver them that first progress report. Next slide. In terms of related work, if you're thinking about ways that you can fortify your submission, you want to think about significant activities that are related to this effort. So it could be something that your principal investigator's done, or it could be potentially a prime contractor. So you want to think about what's your strength when you respond. If you're a newer organization, you'd want to align yourself with whether it's a university, a prime contractor, or consultants that have experience in a certain area. And again, give them a good sense that you know that you'll be able to accomplish the work that you're saying that you can in the SOW. You want to describe those activities, and we call them, they could be outside sources. So you could have consultants and subcontractors, and then outside sources. So it could be maybe someone in manufacturing, or someone that's going to help you with your overall product production. So the technical volume, it needs to ensure that the proposer is allowing the reviewer to understand what's the state of the art in the specific topic. Like what's the real reason that you proposed. In terms of previous work, you want to make sure that you describe previous work related to the proposal effort, but similar. So provide a short description, the client, and again, this may show the potential reviewer that if you have done some work before, it gives them some comfort in knowing that you have the capability and the capacity. And if you're going to include similar work that you've done, include the individuals to be contacted, the date, for completion, phone numbers. So it's also almost like past performance. When you think about RFPs outside of the DOD, they want to know, give us a comfort level. Have you done this before? And to Larry's term earlier, is this risky? Next slide. So what are the next steps for your research? Future research. That's also critical. The government wants to know that there is a strategy and a follow-on. So it's not that you've thought about this, and this talks more about getting into the commercialization, like what's the next step? So you should be thinking about beyond phase 1. So when you start phase 1, you should already be thinking about phase 3, how are you going to commercialize this? And you want to state clearly what you think those results are going to be. And sometimes it's estimating it or projecting it, but it gives them a good sense that you've thought this through, and the significance of phase 1 and phase 2 research. Next slide. So let's talk about the commercialization strategy. We heard earlier about the company commercialization report. This is a little bit more detailed. This talks about how you're going to commercialize, how you're going to sell or generate revenues beyond the SBIR, SBIR, STTR program. The government is specifically looking for how you're going to market this. So you need to show how you're going to approach the market. Do you know the market size? Do you know the pathway from research to market opportunities? So the type of information that you want to include in a commercialization strategy, and I would suggest that you all, if you're not familiar with the Lean Startup, there's a wonderful tool called the Business Model Canvas. That's a very simple way to create a business plan, and it includes a lot of the elements that you would need to have in your commercialization strategy. So as it relates to company information, you want to ensure that you have focused objectives. What are your core competencies, your specialization? Do you know your customer and competition? So who are the potential customers? Is there a clear description of your key technology? What are the advantages, challenges, hurdles? In terms of market, what are your milestones? So milestones, target dates. What's the market size? Do you know who the market is? What's the market share you think you'll have after the first year of sales? Sales after 5 years. I know it sounds like a lot, but the more you can think about this in advance, the better that you'll be able to generate a commercialization plan in phase 2. So they'll look for more information under phase 2 proposal submission versus phase 1. But you want to start thinking about it during phase 1. And of course, IP, you want to think about your intellectual property. That was one of our earlier workshops as well. So please, if you hadn't had a chance, go back and review our intellectual property workshop. And then also any kind of assistance in mentoring and letters of support. So if you're working with a prime contractor and they're able to provide a letter of support, that also helps your case for having that prime contractor or someone that's going to help you take your technology to commercialization. Next slide. I think I've talked about most of the tips that are on this slide, but just the key is if you have a chance to do outreach, that's bullet number 1 on the right side, you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk to potential stakeholders. The earlier you have an opportunity to speak with, whether it's topic authors, prime contractors, there are many events, government events, where you can meet people and try to find a little bit more about the marketing strategy as it relates to the Department of Defense, military applications, as well as in the commercial market. Next slide. I wanted to include some of the minimum requirements for phase 2 commercialization. What's the first product that this technology is going to go into? So do you know, is it going to be inserted into something? Do you need to contact a prime contractor? There's some wonderful tools, budget tools. It's dtic.mil or dtic.mil, where you can actually look at some of the research budget line items, what they're looking for. So the key is if you don't know that, there are some ways to do some research. Who are going to be the customers? How much money are you going to need? So again, some of the questions that you want to address in your commercialization plan, do you have the right expertise? Do you have the business development expertise? And who are the competitors? What's the price range or quality advantage over those competitors? So at minimum, in phase 2, as you'll see, we were just talking about phase 1, you need to do a little bit more homework before you submit your phase 2 commercialization plan. Next slide. In terms of key personnel, I know we had a couple of questions about the actual resumes. You want to make sure that you have a resume. It's not a CV, but it's an actual resume that talks about the person's name, the summary of skills, background, and it supports your staffing effort. So yes, we do want to see full resumes, and it should be a concise. It's your PI, your principal investigator, as well as any of your other key subcontractors or people that are going to be supporting this effort. All resumes do count toward the page limit, so you do want to make sure that you're as concise as possible. And just make sure it's relevant to the actual effort. Next slide. In terms of facilities and equipment, you want to make sure that you justify those purchases. And again, this is something that you're able to reference and review following the workshop. But as it relates to facilities, if you do have the requirement to have any kind of manufacturing working with a partner, you want to make sure that early on that you've addressed the facilities and equipment. And again, they're looking for justification. Next slide. We talked about outside sources, providers. So again, subcontractors, consultants. And I think earlier we talked a little bit about you had other prior, current, or pending support of similar awards. I'll let you read this. It's number 11 on your own. But the key is that you want to make sure that a BAA is substantially the same as another proposal that was funded, is not being funded, is pending with another agency. You must reveal this on your proposal cover sheet. So people have asked questions, can we resubmit? So you want to make sure that that's clear. Next slide. And then as it relates to cost, there is a form, of course, for volume 3 cost. You want to make sure that your cost volume is itemized. You want to ensure that you have been able to document your cost decisions for reference. If asked to discuss that later, so we did make the point of telling you that the costs are reviewed, not necessarily evaluated, so there typically are opportunities for the government after you're awarded to have that kind of cost discussion. And you also want to understand the federal acquisition regulations, and they call also the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, as it relates to the cost, the costing and what needs to, and they usually will reference that. Those are, they're usually numeric, and those are spelled out in the instructions. So the key is, as it relates to cost, you want to develop your cost volume and then actually upload it. Bill, back to you.
Thanks, Lynn. I really appreciate it. That was some really practical advice. And really thanks to all of our panelists and presenters for what I think has been a great discussion thus far. I wanted to take some time to address some of the questions we've been gathering during and prior to this presentation. As a reminder, participants, we will send a transcript of this webinar via email within 30 days. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you have a question, please click on the blue question mark. Finally, I'd like to remind each speaker to state their name and organization prior to sharing their feedback. So I want to get started with a question going back to the debrief process. We've been getting a lot of this prior to the webinar, and this is really for, I think, the components. It seems like there's a lot of questions about what to do if a company disagrees with the feedback they were given in the debrief or sort of the review that came back. If that happens and the company feels that way about their proposal, their proposal response, is there any recourse? How should they respond? Larry, any thoughts from you on that?
No, a debriefing is not supposed to start a debate necessarily. It's supposed to articulate what the evaluator saw in the proposal, and what they saw may differ than what you saw as you wrote the proposal. You are always welcome to send a follow-up email to the component and express concerns with any of the information that may have been conveyed. But unless there is some egregious deviation from your takeaway from the debriefing summary statement, that information is provided as a tool. You're not supposed to necessarily be discouraged from not being selected. It's supposed to be a learning experience when you are a recipient of a non-selected proposal.
Got it. Susan from DARPA, I just want to give you a chance to respond to that in case any I assume much the same comments, but if there's anything different, then please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll echo what Larry said. It's really to be informative, because I think Jangela and others have brought up during the course of this webinar that this program is extremely competitive, and just because you weren't selected the first time out, or even however many times you've submitted, doesn't mean you don't have good ideas. It just means that they didn't make the funding cut a lot of times. My budget is between the two programs, $100 million. So I'm not going to be able to fund as many proposals as I would like to sometimes. So it is just designed to give you enough feedback so that you can learn and maybe do better next time.
Yeah, this is Larry Pollack again, Chem Biodefense. I wanted just to emphasize the fact that sometimes when you read the evaluation comments, they're very positive. They're very positive, and there are relatively few weaknesses. And you'll say, well, if there's so much positive, why wasn't I given the opportunity to be awarded a contract? And it does come down to the number of proposals received in a given topic. Every proposal stands on its own technical merit. Proposals are not compared to each other, and there is a point at which we have to be able to, we have a limitation in financial resources, as was stated earlier, depending on the topic and the amount of money available in any given component. Somewhere between 2 and 4 phase ones are selected. There may be instances where there may be more than 4 proposals that are technically meritorious, and we just have to be able to have a particular cutoff. And if additional funding becomes available, then there may be an opportunity to fund it at some point.
So this is Jangela Shumskis with Cali Group. I just wanted to go back to a statement that Larry made earlier regarding the debrief not being an opening point to engage in debate with a government component. When you're putting your proposal together, that is your opportunity to actually create a conversation. And so what you see typically in a debrief reflected is what the reviewer or evaluator saw in your proposal. And so if they did not pick up on what you were putting down, so to speak, then that means that there was something wrong with the conversation in the proposal. So as you're writing the proposal, one of the things that you should do when you're going through it is think like a reviewer. Is this going to create a question? Am I putting down information that might cause confusion, makes my proposal unclear? Because as a company, you guys know your capabilities and you guys know what you can do, but the best proposal is able to articulate what you can do based on the solution that's required. So I just wanted to go back to that really, really quickly. The basis for conversation is your proposal. And the debrief, if you don't like it, it means that something was wrong with how you structure that conversation.
Got it.
And this is Susan from DARPA. If I could add another thing too, is if possible, get someone that you trust to read your proposal. I think there's some, either free or places that don't charge that much to do proposal review to help you put together your proposals and make sure that you're answering, all the requirements in a solicitation and so forth. So if you have the resources or you have, a place to get that advice from, I would encourage you to seek that advice for your proposals, especially if it's your first time, responding to DOD, who has just a lot of different requirements that we have to follow.
Got it. And so this next question comes in. It's really around past performance. This came up a lot during the presentation, and I'll direct this toward Susan and Colleen. For companies that are new, particularly in the technology space, or I'd imagine it's really translating to the medical space, how can companies sort of get over the past performance hurdle? I mean, I'm hearing from companies they're 3 years old, but they keep losing companies with 10 years of experience. How can they help to bridge that gap? Is it teaming, personnel? Any thoughts on that?
This is Colleen from MRMC, and on behalf of DHA, we don't have a past performance hurdle in the program as far as we've seen, and I'd be surprised if we had one at CBD or DARPA. We are always looking for the most innovative, cutting-edge, new facts. I mean, although we do look at the CAI score, and I believe DARPA said that they kind of use it, Remember, you only get a Commercialization Achievement Index score if you have, I believe, 4 phase 2s over a certain period of time. We're looking for the best solution to the problem, and we're going to look for a team that looks balanced and that they're able to handle the technical complexities of what's being proposed. But my goodness, we've looked at some recent numbers, and we have a high percentage of new proposers each year. And sometimes this is their first time at the rodeo, and we're welcoming that. Thank you.
That's awesome to hear. Lynn, any thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. When companies talk about past performance, that's typically you had a previous contract of some sort. Experience could just be a person's experience. So it could be a PI, prime contractor, your experience as a subcontractor. So you don't want to necessarily confuse past performance with experience. So experience is usually on the individual or company experience, not necessarily contract.
Yeah, so I actually want to agree with Lynn and also state that past performance isn't an evaluation criteria for SBIR. Where past performance comes into play is with the company commercialization report. And if your brand's making new to the process, it's going to be blank. And so it's not evaluated. If anything, in more instances than not, I see the CCR hurting proposers because you get dinged for not having commercialized prior phase 2s. The difference between a young company and a mature company, it's just experience, which is what Lynn just said. And so typically what I see is a young company responding to an SBIR STTR topic for the first time, they don't have a process in place. And so that's the beauty of the workshop that we're having today is you guys are going to walk away with this with a lot of tools to figure out how to make a compliant proposal. And I tell you what, having evaluated and reviewed proposals myself, being compliant is 90% of the game. And doing what you're supposed to do and articulating what your value is, that's 90% of it. And really that's what I see as the big difference between a more experienced and less mature company.
Got it. Thanks for that. So we've heard a lot about, Larry, de-risking from you, about showing innovation. In a lot of ways, the companies demonstrate that is with letters of support. And so I guess the question is, how important are letters of support in the evaluation process?
This is Larry Pollack, Chem Biodefense. The letters of support are useful, particularly from a future commercialization standpoint, looking for technology transition partners. Buying into the proposed technology as being innovative and having a future partner who may be interested in supporting and working with the small business to further develop the technology as its technology readiness level increases, assuming a successful program of record.
Got it. Colleen or Susan, anything to add on that point regarding letters of support?
I think we're pretty close on the letters of support. I think letters of support are more useful in a phase 2 generally than a phase 1 for us. And then in our process, we have what's called a phase 2 enhancement, which is a later package that's possible with matching funding. That's when letters of support get very important for us because that's indicating the source of future non-SBIR dollars. And we have transition personnel that will work with a company when they're at the phase 2 and even phase 1 level to kind of plan and even help them coordinate those types of letters. Thank you.
So this is Jangela Shumskis from Cali Group. I just wanted to mention that any appendices, including letters of support and supporting documents, with the 18.2 BAA, DOD has created something called Volume 5, which is where you put those types of documents. Just be mindful that dependent on component, those letters of support or those supporting documents or those appendices might count towards your page limit. So while those things are great, just make sure that if you're using them, you're being mindful of what the rules are for that particular component and getting your proposal submitted. Again, it's that compliance check.
Got it. This next question is for Susan from DARPA. And the question was, are the travel requirements for phase 2 rewards only? But I want to broaden that a little bit. We talked about the cost proposal a little bit, but Susan, from your experience, you mentioned the travel requirement validation piece. Are there any other sort of big things that you think folks should know about the cost proposal?
So, yeah, that was just a general example. So you can propose travel on phase 1. You know, if you think you might need to come to a kickoff meeting, or you think you might need to do some travel to some, I don't know, event that might support your work. It's not unheard of. I think most of the time it's in phase 2, but the point was to make sure you provide supporting documentation for everything that you're proposing. So if you need a piece of equipment, you know, show that show where you got the estimates from. You got estimates from company A, B, and C for this piece of equipment, and it doesn't have to be the cheapest piece of equipment, as long as you can describe why you need the one that you're picking for this project. You know, maybe it has other features that that are important or would provide better analysis, or whatever it's for. Just make sure that you provide, and just like you wouldn't have somebody do work on your own home and go to the first person that you talk to, right? You're going to get estimates. If you need a plumber, you're going to say, hey, let me get some estimates for this plumbing job, and you want to see what they're going to do, and you want to see them support, you know, where are you going to get these materials that you need to fix my sink. So it's kind of the same thing with us. We want to see, you know, where did you get your estimates from and what are they for? And it doesn't mean we're going to say no. It just means that it helps the contracting officer when he or she is reviewing your cost and determining. They're the ones that the cost reasonableness really falls into their area of expertise. They're the ones that are going to determine if everything's reasonable. So it helps them, and then they don't have to come back to you later and get that information. So anything that you're asking for like that, and just support, like consultants for your subcontracts, I know that can be tricky sometimes. Sometimes the sub doesn't necessarily want to give the prime their rates and things, but that's okay. They can email it directly to the contracting officer if they need that detail. But if you can put some general information in your cost proposal from that sub, then that will be good enough until the contracting officer requests additional details. But it's really about trying not to slow down the contract negotiation and award process, because they have to get, you know, this is going to be a few months after you've submitted your proposal. So then you're going to have to dig up all those estimates or figure out how you came to those estimates when you submitted your proposal a few months before. So it's going to take you time to recreate that, so it's better just to submit it at the time you're submitting your proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. So this next question we've gone through, I think, on previous webinars. And we talked a lot about following instructions, and that's been a recurring theme throughout this workshop series. But I think the question is, if DOD instructions and component instructions conflict, which should be followed? And I definitely want to go to the components for this. So Larry, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one.
The component instructions are paramount because they are specific to that component. They may have special requirements within the component. ChemBioDefense has a number of topics where animal and human use will come into play, and there are specific instructions to ensure compliance with the DOD regulations with the use of animal and humans, as an example. So I would say that the component instructions are supersede anything that is mentioned in the DOD instructions. But when in doubt, ask the question through CITES.
Perfect. And Susan and Colleen, is that the same from your point of view?
Hi, yes, this is Susan from MRMC on behalf of DHA, and I concur with what Larry said in regards to the component-specific instructions and then the DOD instructions. I know the DOD instructions are long, but review those, and then once you find the topic that you're submitting your proposal under, go to the component-specific instructions to read their debrief process, their phase 2 or phase 1 proposal process, and then you can kind of compare the two. But also, as Larry said, you can always ask the question through CITUS, or even you can reach out to our DHA program office if you have any programmatic questions in regards to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. Some of our topic authors may not be able to answer that, but you can always reach out to our office. Thank you.
Got it. I appreciate you guys taking the time to answer those questions. I really appreciate the feedback. It's been something that we saw a lot of recurring themes over the workshop, and those questions I think are very reflective of the feedback we've been getting. So what I want to do now is sort of turn it over to our panelists and our presenters for sort of summaries, closing remarks before we conclude this webinar. Susan and Colleen, I'll start with you all. Any closing remarks before we move on?
This is Colleen for DHA. I just want to really express appreciation for all this information because and putting it out there, because the high quality proposals really help your evaluators to understand, as Jangela said, the conversation that you are opening up with the government. And we all are here to try to build new innovative capabilities for the service member. For us, it's the military health systems service members. And details matter. Knowing that you have awareness of how your proposal complies with, future human subjects issues, or, down the road FDA compliance, these all go a long way to show that you would be a good potential partner for the military. And the SBIR program is a great way to start that relationship. Thank you.
Susan, that's great. Susan, any closing remarks from the DARPA standpoint?
So this is Susan Salas at DARPA, and I would suggest that take the opportunity to reach out to people before you see things out, before you see an open BAA, because you can start that conversation before the pre-release, and there may be other opportunities that you could take advantage of, not just SBIR or STTR, but other, because that can be a challenge sometimes for companies to find a topic that's a direct match to what they're doing. So we have a multitude of other opportunities that may be available. If you can participate in industry days or proposers days for some of our larger BAAs, even if it's to get a chance to talk to a program manager that's working in the same area that you are. And again, back to starting that conversation as early as possible to get a feel for what the program managers here at DARPA are looking for. There's also many times a virtual component to our industry days. So if you can't travel, if you don't have the resources, or if it's just too tight of a time frame when you find out about the events, a lot of times there's a virtual component. And if you found out the information too late and missed it, the materials from the proposers days are always posted to FedBizOps, so you can get yourself caught up later on what occurred and what was discussed. There's FAQs and different things that will be posted. So for SBIR and STTR, I've started doing what I call a virtual proposer day, which I've asked our program managers to provide either a video or a slide deck with additional details and information on their topics and how they relate to their larger DARPA programs. So I would just say give yourself enough time to review these materials, to review information, and to do some homework on the agency you're applying to, and not to wait until the last minute, because as we've all discussed, all of the things that you have to, the checklists and all the things that you have to do, you can't do this at the last minute. You have to give yourself enough time to put together a quality, comprehensive proposal. Thank you.
Great. Larry, any final words?
Yeah, quite a few final words. To piggyback on what Susan just mentioned, which is know the agency that's putting out the topic. You need to kind of envision and know and learn how the technology is going to be used, who's going to be using it, where is it going to be used. In DOD lingo, that would be CONOPS, Concept of Operations. The next point is the work that you're proposing realistically going to be able to be completed given the limited time constraints and funding constraints as well, particularly in phase 1, to do a proof of concept feasibility study. I'll also add that no small business is too small. Many small businesses are small businesses of one. However, to be able to propose the work that you want to accomplish, you may need to build a team with either subcontractors or consultants to make sure that you do have all the expertise available to accomplish the work that you're stating that you wish to do in a proposal. And lastly, I would say good luck, but it's not luck. It's developing and communicating a skill set and the ability to articulate your innovative solutions in the phase 1 and phase 2 proposals. Thank you.
Awesome. Angela, any additional comments?
I actually just have a couple of housekeeping notes, if you will. One of the questions that I have gotten a lot over the years is whether or not proposers should use the maximum allowable page count. So say for phase 1, most components, it's 20 pages in the technical, or whether or not companies should propose less than the threshold. And my answer all the time is simply, you need to be able to tell your story in a way that's going to get you funded. And typically that takes most people more words than less. You're not going to get extra points for being under the page count. So, and I would say the same thing goes for the funding. You're not going to get extra points from an evaluation perspective for proposing substantially less. You need to, there's a cost realism element to when the cost proposal is reviewed by the contracting officer. So propose the cost that is going to be required within the threshold to actually develop the technology. No extra points there either. Again, page lengths for phase 1 and phase 2 are wildly different. Page lengths for phase 2 vary incredibly across components. So make sure that, especially for those of you that play with multiple components, keep your checklist straight and get that right. Earlier on, Lynn mentioned something called the Lean curriculum. I just wanted to note that that's available on the DOD SBIR training site, which is training.defensebusiness.org. That site also has resources, including strategic plans across DOD. So take a look at that. And then finally, Susan Salas at DARPA mentioned participating in events where you can in advance of the BAAs. If you go to SBIR.gov, they have an outreach calendar, which includes industry days. Not all of the DoD industry days are on there, and Air Force actually has quite a lot of them. Industry days are also advertised through FedBizOps. And that's all I had.
Angela, thank you for that, and thank you to all of our presenters and panelists. I'd now like to introduce Jason Talley, the VIQ Training and Advocacy Project Manager, to take us through the upcoming workshops in the series and next steps.
All right, thank you for that, Phil, and good afternoon, everybody. Once again, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and components that participated today, and to also remind people that there will be slides sent out within the next 10 business days with a transcript and also the slide deck, and also for questions that have not been answered during today's workshop. But let's talk about our upcoming events. On July 17th, we'll be discussing how to prime contractors, and we'll have a panelist to present this workshop. And right now we have some great panelists for this workshop. Confirmed are Lockheed Martin, CACI, Northrop Grumman, and BAE, and we're still working on more. So definitely join us on July 17th for that workshop. Also on August 1st, we will review the DoD acquisition process and how that relates to the SBIR. And then finally, on September 4th, we'll go over commercialization assistance programs and beyond phase 2 considerations. So definitely stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. All right, so I also want to talk about a couple of events that are very important to the community. The first one is the Beyond Phase 2 and Mentor Protege Training Week. This is going to happen on August 14th through August 16th in Orlando, Florida, and will provide a great venue for SBIR and STTR firms to meet with government and industry stakeholders about current efforts as well as important future initiatives. During the Phase 2 training week, there will be several important events where you are invited to participate. All right. I wanted to highlight breakout sessions, technology showcase, and matchmaking as particularly key events where you will have the opportunity to meet directly with acquisition personnel, prime contractors, and peers in the SBIR program. I truly hope you consider participating in August, and I'll see you in Orlando. Another great event that I want to mention is DARPA D60 Symposium. D60 will be held September 5th through the 7th at the National Harbor in Maryland. This event will highlight DARPA's work in breakthrough technologies and is for a wide range of agency stakeholders, including SBIR participants. More information can be found at the link provided in the slides and also in this email. And if you need more information, please email darpa60@darpa.mil. Once again, that's darpa60@darpa.mil if you need more information. All right, next slide, please. Okay, as usual, we love your feedback about our workshops. We're hoping that these are very helpful to you, but also your feedback helps us determine what our next workshops are and helps us improve upon how we present our workshops. You can connect with us at SBIRtraining@bitecube.com. Once again, that's SBIRtraining@bitecube.com. All right, and once again, thank you for your attendance and we encourage you to join us for future and additional workshops. Thank you and have a great day.